trying to sort out life. A lot of us thought we had it down, but I didn't have it down probably, and was driving down Sunset Boulevard. It was late at night on Christmas Eve, and we'd already had some kind of family gathering, and it was now into the wee hours, and I'm just driving, kind of reflecting, and I realized the world was not what it was meant to be. I'd come to that conclusion, and I realized I wasn't all that I was meant to be. And I remember seeing this sign that said, Christmas Eve candlelight service, midnight, right on my clock. It was just kind of heading towards midnight. And so I pulled over, pulled in, went in, and I don't remember all the details of the night. What I do remember is there was something about that night in which I felt that the whole world had paused. Something had crept into the world that was setting it right. And I left that night with that feeling, and I'll tell you something, nothing's ever changed. There's something about this night that has always given me a sense that the world quiets down, slows down its pace, and yet what I feel is not that there's less at hand. I feel like there's more at hand. Do you know what I mean? When you feel like the world slows down on this night, unlike any other night, and yet it's left not in a quietness of emptiness, but in the presence of something bigger. It's feeling like God has crept in to take his world back. It's feeling of God coming in and saying that eternity has a will and a work that is greater than all the powers of this world. And that something on this night is declaring that this is the way it should be. And it affects my senses deeply about the world that we live in. And it's full of mystery, but the idea that God has come somehow to engage us, one realm to another. Many of us are familiar perhaps with the closest disciple of Jesus himself, who would write it and try to say it this way when he wrote, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." John's reaching for this word, using this word, because he's speaking of how the ultimate authority, the one who can speak everything else into existence, but exists outside of that existence, speaking it into existence, that very one had come into its own existence. That's an incredible thing to imagine. I mean, it's so profound. It's a reason why we can keep gathering and never feel like we can grasp it, because we are finite. We're talking about the infinite, of course, but we're talking of God who's had no beginning and no end, entering into time and space. We're talking about one who has known no boundaries, entering in to the body of a baby, dependent on a teenage girl. That's remarkable. And I know that as we think of that, there's part of us that perhaps feels like this is what truly I need to know, that there is a greater dimension. Something inside me says that I know there can be another part. Particularly in our current culture, there's almost like a popular trend in the last few years to kind of have a bravado perhaps of saying, you know what, there's nothing more than this. This is all there is. That is kind of maybe a way to express one's sense of courage, that I have the courage to believe the hard facts. Or perhaps a way of saying that I'm a person of facts and that's just the way it is. I don't believe in anything else. And I can understand that. But I want to encourage you, if you're one who maybe even in part finds a draw to that, I want to encourage you tonight just to find reason perhaps to pause. I think there's reasons to pause and wonder if the world as you really know it is really one in which it suggested that there's nothing more. I think that if there's anything we've learned, it's really that over time we've learned that the world doesn't say this is all there is. The world suggests that it all points to something beyond itself. Even those who in the sciences that are most into quantum physics and looking at such things are saying, Our existence in time and space, there has to be a dimension outside of time and space. And I think our own internal longings tell us, too, that it points to something outside of us. And I think if we reflect deeply on what it is that we long for, that it points us to the existence of one who would come and do just what he did tonight. That's exactly it. And I think we do well to pause and realize that our problem's always been limited perspective. We think we see everything, so we assess what's real and right, and we're confident of it. Usually proves that we just didn't have enough perspective. After all, not long ago, really, we were very clear. Everybody knew the world's flat. They did. I mean, the world's flat. It's obvious it's flat. You and I can go outside and walk anywhere. What does it look like? Flat. Eventually, we have this whole, oh my, and huge conflict. We can't have that wrong. There's lots of pride behind that. We realize that the world is not flat. Why did we have it so wrong? Because with a limited perspective, it's all you can see. It's understandable. And then we were confident that the sun revolves around the earth. Okay, we're on a globe, and every morning I wake up, that thing comes up. That thing's rotating around me. I'm the center of things. We were wrong. We're actually rotating around it. But can you understand why we had it wrong? We had a limited perspective. Until you step back further, you have to assume your things, but when you step back further, you're like, oh, my encouragement tonight, step back a little further. Step back a little further and you begin to see that actually our existence suggests that there is actually something beyond it. And that's precisely what we gather of is the profound nature that what is outside came within. And when he came, he said some things, declared some things to us, to this earth, about the way things should be. And so I just want to invite us to briefly reflect on in what way do we have a sense of that, or how did I sense that, and what would I encourage you? And the first thing I think we reflect upon is just the people, God included. Like the world I live in, and I think it's the same one you live in, we are really good at deciding who's important. We're really good at deciding who are the popular people, who are the power brokers, who do you want to work with if you're going to do anything of any real value. We're masters of it. And in the last few years through like social media and likes, we're really masters of it. We've got it totally down. God completely defies it. On this night, he goes to a people who are kind of nomadic, kind of left out. Yes, everyone saw that there are people formed by a God who said he's not like the capricious God. He's the creators of the heavens and the earth, but they're now kind of under the oppression of Rome. And you really would go and work with them, let alone go to a young girl who lives in the backwoods. Nazareth. You got to be kidding. Think Barstow, okay? Just think Barstow. And whatever your feelings are about Barstow, get real with yourself. That's how people felt about Nazareth. You just know, like, come on. If the creator of the universe was going to come and do anything of value, there's a lot of places, L.A., New York, maybe, but, a few people I can think of, maybe, but the whole story is so profound. That's why we're drawn into it. But why are we drawn into it? Why does it feel so right? Because something tells us that everyone matters. And on this night, God declares everyone matters. And something in my soul says that's the way it should be. That you and I have lived long enough in this kind of crazy popularity contest, and that's what we live in. I know most of us would like to think, oh, I'm not into that. Go ahead and try to believe that, but you are. We're all in it. We all wake up trying to figure out, how does my life really matter? Do I really belong? How do I prove it? I don't want to prove it. I'll just pull it. We're always in this thing. We're always trying to figure out if we matter. And on this night, God says everyone matters. And many would say, well, no, God's showing that he favors the poor. And it does appear that God has a favoritism towards the poor. But I want to be clear that God's not favoring the poor or Mary or as a peasant or anything else merely because she's a different class of people. What God makes very clear in the whole of the story and everything we come around tonight is that it's not favoritism of a class, that he's always going to do one thing: raise up the humble and bring down the proud. And that's what he's always doing. You can have little money and be proud, and you may have great wealth and be humble. But the heart of the issue is that God wants to meet the human heart, and he knows this. Our human hearts have a fundamental problem. Our whole demise is because we tried to be more than human. And when you try to be more than human, you will find yourself trying forever to be something you're not, trying forever to find you're important. Once we tried that, we became separated from God, said we'll do our own thing. And once you're doing your own thing and trying to find your own meaning and your own value, you will find your entire life desperately searching. And I will admit, not only have I known my life through its own desperate searches, if I was honest, it never completely goes away. To whatever degree that I'm trying to find myself in what I do and how I'm different or anything else, we're going to find that we're always desperately searching, always coming up empty, always trying to vie in this world. And on this night, what God says, to all who will humble themselves, you will find out you matter a lot. You will find out you're already on the in. This is this inclusive story. And that's what God set right. And so on this night that maybe like you've wondered, gosh, it's so sad that on a night like this there are people who maybe wonder if they matter. There's people who are on the streets tonight in very cold times, alone, feeling like nobody cares and that they certainly don't matter. And God says they matter. And to every doubter in us, or every doubting part of us that says, I don't know if I matter and belong, God says tonight, you matter. And that's why this night always feels like it's telling me something that is right. Always right, but it got set right in the things that took place on this night. And so we sang and declared in the song, O Holy Night, the beautiful line that affirms this when it says, long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared, and the soul felt its worth. On this night, I feel like God is bringing to bear into this world the potential for every soul to feel its worth. And we might wonder, yeah, but look at the way that lives are treated in this world. There's an oppression that's always at hand. And I think that is also what God makes very clear tonight, that on this night, God reveals all oppression ceases because he is in control. And what we find in everything that we come around tonight, don't miss the fact that God was so clearly setting up the ultimate showdown between all the powers of this world and his power and his ultimate control. If you look through, this is so clearly what rises up. You have the whole social oppression, and oppression is simply, for the most part, it's not just us wanting power. We all maybe want power. It's when we want more power than others. That's when it's oppression. It's when we want power over other people that it becomes oppressive. And it's to that struggle with power that God says, okay, I'm going to take a woman who has very little power, and there will be much that comes against her. Watch what I do. And Herod would rise up as a great king and say, hey, she's a threat to me. I'm going to wipe out anyone who has a child during this season because I want to make sure no one vies for me. And he becomes political oppression. Not to mention Caesar decides to have a little taxes going on. I almost think like God was standing back going, oppression, taxes. That'll last for 2,000 years. We still don't like taxes. And so right there in the story, you have Caesar, you have the whole of the Roman Empire. No empire like it, raised up with many strengths, but with also these highly oppressive forms of false peace. And then you have the religious leaders and religious oppression, which may be the worst because the religious leaders, they're claiming God's on their side, and he's not. And to all this that comes against this child that was being born that night, I find myself saying, God confronted them all and subverted them all. All. Nothing could rise up and prove that it was in control. God was in control. Not only was this child born, he would overcome the powers of the religious oppression, the Roman Empire would fall, Jesus would be raised up, and he would declare, this is the way the world should work, and all oppression, ceases. And this is why we read in Revelation so beautifully of the way that it ultimately is, because of course oppression hasn't been brought to an end, but Jesus said, watch, it is coming to an end. God says, I didn't come merely to fix the world, like, hey, I can do a few things and we'll get this thing working perfect. No, he came to resolve who rules. And there's a difference. And that's what happened that night. And then he tells us what it will be like when he does rule. And what does it say in the book of Revelation? It says, I heard a loud shout from the thrones declaring this, at the end of time as we know it. Look, the home of God is now among men. Meaning, you've seen heaven enter the world when Jesus was born, but at one point, heaven will come and they will be perfectly united. And this is the time it speaks of. And it says, now when God is now among men, he will live with them and they will be his people. Yes, God himself will be among them. He will wipe away all tears from their eyes. There will be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, nor pain. All of that has gone forever. That is what began. And that's what we're told on that night long ago, the way things will ultimately be. All oppression will cease. And if you're young here tonight, I hope that's good news. If you're older here tonight, I'm sure that's good news. Because we want to know, is this it? No, it's not. It's not over. And that's why we can sing, as we sang on Holy Night, the wonderful refrain, chains he shall break, for the slave is our brother. And in his name, all oppression shall cease. And on that night, I would also add, God reveals that peace prevails. God brings peace. He makes it possible here on earth. And this, of course, is so clearly what God sees, is that the world is not living as it's supposed to. Not with God, not with each other. There's this lack of peace. And so, as we so often hear, the prophet Isaiah, God had spoken this long before about what this night was about. And he said this to us, to hear. He said, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. We're talking a whole new regime going on here. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. It's to this that the fulfillment of this was taking place on that night. Why did the angels come? To declare something great? Because they were declaring peace. Remember, they said, glory to God in the highest and peace on earth. And this peace, it rings out to all of creation. We can almost hear it, this call to peace, like it's calling us. But it's more than just calling us. We will be called as peacemakers, but it's also saying that God is bringing an element of peace. And I need to know that. I need to know that it's not just merely that, well, I hope we can do a real good job. I hope we can do a real good job and see if we can have some peace treaties. Those would be really good. We've never kept one peace treaty through all of human history. Not one. Rome had one of the greatest forms of peace. They had this kind of system in which they thought they could contain and control everyone and keep everything peaceful. It didn't work. It's not merely about what we can do. It's about God saying, I am going to restore peace. And that's certainly what he did. And he comes to make that clear, that I will set the human heart at peace, because if we're not at peace within ourselves, we will never be at peace among ourselves. And this world will never be at peace. It will always be vying. And this is why we look and we can feel like, I need to know that God's done something that will end in peace. That the wars that we see and we feel, and they're still there, many people have gathered through the years during world wars, but we still gather with grand conflicts that run through this world. There are more nations at war, more destruction at hand right now than ever before. Since 9/11, there's been like 480,000 people killed as part of the war on terror. 240-some thousand civilians. We now have, I believe it's 350 million children who are living in war zones. That's 1 in 6 children live in a war zone. That's 75% more than just a couple decades ago. Now the world is longing for peace, and it's struggling to want to know, as most of us do, can there be peace? Some of you may have heard the song, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. It's a Christmas carol that was based on the 1863 poem called Christmas Bells by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And Longfellow had his own life and peace disrupted deeply. He had lost his wife of 18 years to fire in 1861, and then 2 years later, his son goes into the Civil War against his will, and that son would be wounded and nearly paralyzed just before Christmas. And on Wadsworth, on Christmas Day, he heard the Christmas bells, and he wrestled with this question of peace, and so he wrote these words. He said, I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong, and it mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. But then he says, but then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. We have to look beyond the powers of this world and realize there is a peace that will ultimately be made, but it is made within us. It begins within us. We cannot merely hope for peace if we don't recognize that we also are the ones who need to find peace with God, because any soul that doesn't is going to be trying to fight and prove and gain and feel nothing else really matters. And so it is that we find that there's this constant refrain that says there can be peace. And we can sing ultimately that grand song and refrain that we sang in O Holy Night that says, truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love and his gospel is peace. That is the good news. That is what Jesus said he came constantly to bring, is to bring this world to that place where we no longer see ourselves divided and separated and our identities divided. And we don't find ourselves in all these divided identities. We see ourselves and understand ourselves to be those people who have one Father and one God who loves us all. And we see that dignity, and we can work and live within that. But it means that place of coming home to that Father and saying, I kind of surrender, if you will, this fight. And maybe tonight, for some of us, we just kind of know, I don't have that peace in my heart. And as somebody said, Jesus is the ultimate and only universal agent of peace. He's the one who comes to say, I will settle your own separation from God. And then with that, I settle the separation that otherwise you would have with others, that I will help make all united again in that. And he only begins it in us, but it is that fundamental beginning. And it begins when you and I come to a place where we say, all right, my will, your will, I give up my will. I'm not the center. I'm not God. And I receive that you have come to meet me in my own rebellion. And that is where peace begins. Some of us need to know, maybe it's time for a truce on that war, because you're not going to win it anyways. Might as well call a truce. And I invite us to and receive that and know that on this night, everyone matters. On this night, God declares that oppression ceases. And on this night, God shows us that peace prevails, and it begins when we join in. So I'm going to invite us to pray. I invite you to pray, and you can take a moment with God as I lead us. God, we live in a world in which something does seem like it's come into this world on this night. Something seems to hush the world a little bit, and we sense there's not less here, there is more, there's you. And that you have been showing us a song we could never quite sing until you sang it. You are shining a light on the way things are. We don't see it all, but oh, we've seen the way things should be. We've lived with a problem we could never understand, and then you came and showed us the way it should be. So on this night, we thank you that you have set things right, that you have come to resolve forever what we cannot. And we open our hearts to receive you, to receive the peace that you offer. And I just invite you in your own heart, because only you and I can do this personally, to just, if you sense that your heart has not known that peace, he is the one who brings that peace. And I just invite you to welcome him, to be the one who you receive to end all the separation, all the striving, and to be the life that comes not only into this world, but into your own world.